In this video we are going to go through an introduction to algebra. The learning goal for this video is to understand the language of algebra and to go through some of the important rules when working with algebraic expressions. Algebra provides a short way of writing ideas in mathematics. And when writing algebraic expressions, firstly we use letters called a pronumeral to stand in the place of a number. We also are always trying to shorten or simplify as much as possible. So when following the rules that we go through today, the key here is that we are trying to simplify and to shorten our calculations to make it as simple as possible. There's a few key words that are important to know when looking at algebra. The first one is this number here. So any number that is attached to a letter in algebra, firstly is actually being multiplied. Again, it's a way of shortening our expression. We'll go through this a bit later. We do not write the multiplication sign, we just write them right next to each other. But any number that is attached to a letter or right next to a letter with no calculation sign in between is called the coefficient. The next important term that we're looking at is the actual letter that we use in algebra. So any letters that we use in algebraic expressions or equations are known by three different words. The first one is pronumeral, which we introduced in the start of the video. So any letter in the algebraic equation is called a pronumeral. It can also be referred to as the unknown and also sometimes referred to as the variable. So all of these three words refer to any letter that occurs in algebra. And lastly is this number here. So any number that is not attached at all to any of the variables in an equation, so it's on its own, is called a constant. And the reason for that is because it's not going to be changed, or its value isn't going to be changed in any way. There's a few rules when going through algebra equations, and these rules are there to simplify as much as possible. Firstly, like we went through just previously, the multiplication sign is not written and is basically invisible. So if we have our first example here, which is 5 times b, we don't write the multiplication sign and we just write the number and letter right next to each other. So that can be simplified to 5b. The next one is a times b times c. So again, in algebra, we do not write the multiplication sign, so that just gets simplified to A, B, C. So let's do a few of the questions here. So 5 times k, we remove that multiplication sign, so that is 5k. M times n becomes mn. 3 times x times y becomes 3xy. And a times x is ax. So just quickly before we move on to the next rule, it's important with algebra with our x's that we write them the curly way or the cursive way. And the reason for that is so that they don't get confused with multiplication signs. And we'll see an example of why that's important later. So as you can see, our first rule here is that with multiplication signs, we do not write them and they are invisible. So whenever you see a number right next to a letter, it basically means that they're being multiplied, but we just don't write that because we want to try and simplify our calculations. The second rule here is where a number is written before the variable. So if you remember, the variable is any letter that's in an algebra equation. So if we have this sum here, which is a times 4 in our example, we're actually going to write 4, and remember we don't write the times sign, and then we put our variable. So we always write the number first. So in the next example, we've got 3 times x times 2. So here we've got 3 times 2 times x. And we can actually simplify that further because we can simplify 3 times 2, which equals 6. So that is 6x. The next one are some questions that you can do. So 3 times 2 times m. Again, we're going to do 3 times 2, which is 6m. Next, we have 4 times 2. So remember, our number goes first, so 4 times 2 is 8. And then we're going to write in our letters, which is A and b, and we're not going to write our times sign in there. And lastly, we have a times b times 5. We're going to write our number first, and then we're going to write our variables or our pronumerals, and we're going to leave out the multiplication sign. So that's our second rule. The third rule that we're going to be looking at is variables are written in alphabetical order. So sometimes in algebraic equations you'll have lots of different variables and they signify different values of numbers. So for example here you have y times z times x. And if you remember in our first rule we don't write our multiplication signs. So we're going to get rid of those multiplication signs, and then to follow this rule we need to write them in an alphabetical order. So this one is simplified to x, y, z. Let's do the first example for this rule, or the first question. M times a times c, that will actually be a, c, m. So we're going to write in alphabetical order, and we are going to get rid of the times sign. In the second example here, we're going to combine all the rules that we've learnt so far. So first we're going to write our number, so 4 times 3 is 12, and then we're going to write our variables and we're going to write them in alphabetical order. So I've got an A and then I've got a B, so it'll be 12AB. Our next rule is indices are written when they are multiplied together. So if you remember from when we looked at index numbers, if I had, for example, 2 squared, that means it's 2 times 2. Or if I had 4 to the power of 3, I'm going to write 4 times 4 times 4. So we're going to use the same index rules when it comes to algebra as well. So if we look at this rule here, the indices are written when they are multiplied together. So c times c, we've got the exact same variable there. They're being multiplied twice together, so that's going to be simplified to c squared. And here is that example that I mentioned earlier where it's important to write your x's different to your multiplication sums so you know which is the variable and which is your multiplication sign. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, so this is x to the power of 4. Next, m times m is m squared, and here we're going to do the a times a, which is a squared, and then just the b next to it, so it'll look like a squared b, and we've written that in alphabetical order. The last rule that's important here is division is written as a fraction. So the first number in your division sum is written as the numerator, and the second one is going to be written as your denominator, so that's x over 5. So the next example here, we've got a divided by b, so a over b. Here we've got 7 divided by a, so 7 over a. And this one here is 6c divided by 9. One thing to note here, again, if you remember, algebra is all about making sure everything is as simple as possible. We've learnt about simplifying fractions. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cancel down this fraction because I know that 3 goes into both. So 3 goes into 6 twice, and 3 goes into 9 3 times. So I've simplified my fraction as well. So I want you to pause the video, have a go at some of these questions using the rules that we've gone through, and then we will go through the answers together. So let's look at these questions. So question 1 is w times 5. So if you remember our rule, we've got to write our number first. We don't write our multiplication sign, so it's 5w. Question 2 is m times m. So we can use our index rule, so that will be m squared. The next one, 3 times c times b times a. So that's going to be 3a, b, c. The next one, 7 times w times 3 times x. So 7 times 3 equals 21 times w. Sorry, I'll write that a little clearer. W, x. So that's written in alphabetical order. Next one, we're going to use our index rule. So a to the power of 3 and c squared. And we're not going to write any multiplication signs in between. The next one here is 13 divided by bracket a times 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write it as a fraction. And then we're going to do BIDMAS, which says that we have got to do our brackets first. So 13 divided by 2a. And that can't be simplified any further, so I'm just going to leave it at that. The last one, we're going to multiply our numbers first. So 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. Then I've got d times d, which is d squared. And lastly, r. So there's a few rules here that it's important to follow when simplifying algebraic rules. Sometimes you'll need to use more than one rule when simplifying algebraic expressions, but it's important also to remember the language of algebra.